All right, Dr. Dieter, do you want to kick us off?
Yes, hello. Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Dr. Katie Dieter, and I'm the Associate Director in African and African American Studies here at Stanford University. And I would like to start off this evening's event with a land acknowledgement for us at Stanford. And I encourage you to do the same for the places that you currently reside. So we recognize that Stanford University sits on the ancestral land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. Consistent with our values of community and inclusion, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you to today's event titled Emerging Directions in Black Studies, a Fireside Chat with Doctoral Students. We are thrilled to be joined by a number of incredible graduate student panelists from various institutions to engage in scholarly work in the field of Black studies. African and African American studies promotes an understanding of how history informs the present and inspires an engagement with the past in order to collectively dream a more just and equitable future. Here at Stanford, our faculty, staff, and students value the interrelated nature of the personal and the political, and aim to create a community that allows for intellectual and personal flourishing. The program's interdisciplinarity equips students with the tools to produce revolutionary scholarship, question all assumptions and norms, and confront the power imbalances of our social reality. In February of 2021, the provost at Stanford announced that the program in African and African American Studies would become a department, which is an effort brought about by student and community demand. We are very excited about the future as we become a department in African and African American Studies. Next, I would like to introduce Darion Wallace, who is currently a graduate fellow in AAAS and the organizer of the event this evening. Darion Wallace is a third-year doctoral student in the Stanford Graduate School of Education in the Race, Inequality, and Language in Education program, where he studies the transgressive power of the interlocking movements for abolition and Black education in 19th century California. This year, Darion serves as one of the 2022-2023 African and African American Studies graduate fellows, alongside Umia Najir, who is a PhD candidate in modern thought and literature, and Aliyah Dunn Salahuddin, who is a PhD candidate in history. I am personally so grateful for Darion, and working with him this year has just been a real pleasure, and particularly for his vision and execution of this evening's event. So thank you very much, Darion. And without further delay, I will pass the mic to Darion. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you, Dr. Dieter, for that generous introduction, and welcome into the program. I'm here to say that we are so excited to welcome you all as we're gathered here for the inaugural Stanford Emerging Directions in Black Studies panel. The scholars that we have in community with you all today have a fidelity to the intertextual and transdisciplinary mode of scholarly inquiry that is Black studies, which dynamically describes, indexes, and theorizes Black life and culture with nuance, clarity, and beauty. And so to begin our conversation, we're going to invite one of the doctoral students to share with us a lay of the land of Black studies. And so I'm going to introduce Melaine. Melaine is a PhD candidate in the Department of Africana Studies at Brown University. She earned a BA in sociology from Spelman College with concentrations in comparative women's studies and African diaspora and the world. Her research interests include Black aesthetics and culture, Black internationalism, and Afro-diasporic consciousness movements. Her current work is a cultural history and exploration of Afro-surrealism throughout the Black radical tradition, emphasizing 20th century US and Francophone Caribbean history, art, and activism. Her other intellectual pursuits include discussions about love, trauma, Black study, and the blues of contemporary Black life. She holds graduate fellowships and affiliations with the Pembroke Center for Research and Teaching on Women, the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, and the Call Institute for the Humanities, and the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America. In addition to her graduate work, Melaine is a poet and curator who enjoys jazz and soul music, language learning, and stand-up comedy. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you all to Melaine.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Very excited to be here. Again, my name is Melaine, and I'm very happy to connect with you all and honored to be able to give some of today's opening remarks. This conversation is timely, given the recent questioning of Black Studies scholarship in American schools, the backlash against the inclusion of key Black scholars, philosophies, and movements from the College Board's proposed AP African American Studies course reminds us that Blackness, the Black experience, and the centrality of categories of difference to the making of the modern world are considered subjects of insufficient amplitude and depth to justify general study and instruction on all education levels. Too often, what passes for education in the university actually only succeeds in ignoring the relationship between what education deals with in the classroom and what the real world is actually like. The academy, so to speak, then, is in a very tough place, since these endeavors to separate study from quote unquote real life and the life of the mind from the life as it is lived physically. Subject to its own ivory towerism, this separation of the university from the university to the streets, the real university to the real world, deprives the educational process itself from its most vital function, to prepare students for the society in which they must live. What we have seen, and what I hope we delve further into today, is that the university is not basically an educational institution, but a political institution that moves in terms of both political and economic power, that reinforces its politics and creates its proper truths via education. Black studies education, then, is unavoidably a political thing, an ethical thing, a value thing, especially as it pertains to identity, to purpose, and to emerging directions. The contradiction that confounds us in this space, as doctoral students and perhaps even future members of the professoriate, is reckoning with the university as an appendage of the power structure, but also a potential place where the truth can be sought, depending on who you ask, of course. The problem with Black studies, if there is a problem, is one that is usually phrased in terms of matters of legitimacy in power-granting institutions, and the university is no exception. As Black studies scholars, we return to intellectually defending and redefining again and again Black issues and Black themes as not only a genuine basis for thought and a genuine basis for instruction, but as scholarship that clarifies how to actualize better conditions for our collective futures. Black studies is, or Black studies should be, inextricably bound to Black struggle and to community responsiveness to disease, to discrimination, and truth in thought and truth in expression. The possibility that Black studies presents, or why it is perceived as a problem or a threat in the first place, is that at its core, it calls for the rethinking of the universal and of particularities, the complete deconstruction of old world visions and old world vocabularies used to name and draw circles around what should be free and what should be unbordered. Beyond the complexity of identifying the manifestations and the policies of power, Black studies places the Africana perspective, Blackness as a condition, at the center of time, space, and of event. It offers us strategies for coping and surviving and transcending many of the issues that shape Black people's livelihoods. This conversation this evening and our panelist presentations should help us reckon a little bit with the nation's academic, and by extension, its political and its spiritual unwillingness to confront reality, especially an unpleasant and threatening reality. To argue that this must change would be a dramatic understatement, given that this struggle and this very situation are not new phenomena. The roles we've undertaken are shaping the future of liberatory education and pedagogy, and converge life as it is described in the school or in the university, and life as it is, the one that continues to inspire our love, our protests, and our collective vexation. In 2022, I conducted a report on the state of Black studies in the 21st century American University, along with a brilliant colleague of mine, Darion Wallace, a PhD student as well in the Department of Africana Studies. I'd like to share some of its findings for us all today as a brief overview of the contemporary state of the discipline and as a point of departure for thinking about its emerging directions. This report has been slightly revised from the 2022 version to account for the changes of 2023 and has been greatly abridged for the sake of time. To begin, with any assessment, I think it's important to understand where conversations on Black studies are located. Outside of the university context, discussions on the what is and what is not Black studies can mostly be found in the press, in professional organizations, on social media, and word of mouth and salon conversations between writers, friends, thinkers outside and inside of the academy. Some important considerations are that Black studies is a very special field, one that I think uniquely operates within and outside of the academy in legitimate, that is to say, real ways with real consequences. I think an important distinction to be made for this conversation is when we're referring to Black studies in the university and those forms of Black studies that exist outside of it. For the sake of this, I'll be focusing primarily on Black studies academically and institutionally. Particular attention should be paid to the roles of journals and conferences in our Black studies communication processes. A review of leading journal publications and conference themes provided a summary of the major trends and themes in the field of the past 8 years. From, in no particular order, the top trends as perceived by the major journals and the major conferences in the Black Studies discipline are Black Studies in Commemoration, that has to do with reparations, reflecting on what Black Studies is and has been, Black Internationalism, conversations about diaspora, what is understood as otherwise studies, which is imaginings, futurity and Afrofuturism, possibility, remaking, undoing, rebuilding, and gender and sexuality, queer theory, as well as place, space, land, and urbanity. An undercurrent, or what I would consider an honorable mention of this conversation that runs throughout each of the trends, have been explicitly highlighted and with less frequency, are themes around social crisis at large, catastrophe, death, and what do we do with unlivable conditions as it pertains to Black life. Last year in 2022, the National Council for Black Studies conducted an analysis of 188 doctoral dissertations in Black studies from between 2005 and 2021. The institutions that they surveyed were Berkeley, Harvard, UMass Amherst, Michigan State University, Northwestern, and Temple. In their study, they found that the most prominent subject areas of doctoral dissertations, from highest to lowest, were around Black social organizations and organizing, Black creative production, Black history, Black religion and theology, and the last was STEM. Doctoral dissertations are a defining feature of higher education academic departments, and a review of a department's doctoral dissertations helps to highlight and identify the most important subject matter to the departments, but also the most frequently or infrequently studied geographic areas. And so this is of central importance because doctoral output usually overdetermines or determines what doctoral scholars and what future professors in the field are actually interested in and what is actually being funded as it pertains to the discipline. So there are three important dimensions in the evolution of Black Studies programs since their emergence in the 1960s. The first being the institutionalization and organization of departments and programs, the development of academic and administrative instruments dealing with the nature of the discipline, such as their methods, their pedagogy, their conferences, as I just mentioned, and the preparation of scholars and graduate programs, especially as it pertains to graduate training, mentorship, assessment, and dissertation forms. Some of the perceived challenges from the report conducted, there are actually several, but like I said, for the sake of this presentation, I'm only going to name a major three. The first being the challenge of incorporating Africa and the African world into the overall discipline. There have been accusations that a lot of Black Studies departments in the US, especially those that claim themselves to be Africana or diasporic, focus too much on the Western Hemisphere. The second is the mission and waning links to the community. Black Studies was institutionalized as a mission-oriented discipline with two areas of concern and struggle, the first being community and the second being campus life. The responsibility to serve communities as a core principle of Africana Studies is an ongoing concern for scholars, as links to community has waned from most departments over the last couple of decades. And the National Council for Black Studies, in their own report, quoted that or noted that the biggest challenge facing Black Studies departments in fulfilling their overall mission stems from their failure to operationalize the Black community. The last being defending the discipline itself and the issue over it being a multi or interdisciplinary discipline at large. So part of the issue is attention to intellectual genealogies and methods, and the mere study of Black people or inclusion of Black literature is not Black studies. So part of the issue is that although the Afrocentric School of Black Studies agrees that there is only one discipline, and many will claim that Black Studies itself is its own discipline, there still seems to be a confusion or a debate as to whether Black Studies can flourish in non-Black Studies departments, with many scholars claiming to do Black Studies in more traditional disciplines such as English or sociology, psychology, anthropology, etc. Defending Black Studies as a discipline in and of itself, for some reason, continues to be a major challenge. So some of the broader recommendations for a lot of these challenges include defining and outreaching to local Black communities to solve the issue in the strain between the Black community and the campus community, a renewed interest in community-oriented research, hiring faculty with terminal degrees in Black Studies who can undertake these projects and who can stay in the department to make sure that they're brought to fruition, an emphasis on Africanist paradigms and intra-Africa research, an investment in Africana digital humanities to bridge divides throughout the African world/diaspora, and creating a specific faculty position for digital humanities or for Black digital humanities in the department on the tenure track. And prioritizing the Black intellectual worker, defense of, and or who works in the service of Black people, specifically folks who are interested in organizing work and non-academic jobs, and other forms of labor that have to do with Black intellectualism or intellectual life. And lastly, an emphasis on new forms of documentation, new ways to publish and communicate with other Black studies professionals, and again, reiteration of the need for a Black digital humanities and using technology as a way-making tool for people who desperately want to be in communication as it pertains to these issues. So in addition to the general report that was conducted by my colleagues Darion and myself, we also received responses from graduate students at Brown University and at UC Irvine, ranging from second-year graduate students to seventh-year graduate candidates. We received responses from about 10 to 12 students, and then in order to supplement that, we also surveyed social media exchanges and word-of-mouth conversations to talk to graduate students in Black Studies about their perceptions of the most visible trends in the discipline. The perceived trends from many graduate students are as following, in no particular order. 1, interest in the human and the non-human generally. 2, Afro-pessimism. 3, sound studies and by extension music studies. 4, otherwise studies, futurity, end of the world, imagining, possibility, etc. Ecology, land, animal studies. Black critical theory, psychoanalysis, quote unquote high theory in the Black studies discipline, and again, queer theory and feminisms. An important note on this list is that despite the perception that the ontological turn is a leading area of interest, history and social sciences still overdetermine contemporary Black studies in the doctoral outputs in terms of dissertations when it comes to institutional power, economic investment and funding, and in turn the dissertation topics. So what you traditionally find is that most institutions invest in the Black studies dissertations that look most like traditional disciplines, that most look like history dissertations, or most look like sociology or English dissertations, whereas those that are traditionally using that are alternatively using Black studies methodology or using the Africana perspective as their foremost area of critique or foremost method of critique are usually not as supported when it comes to funding or when it comes to the way that the institutions support the candidates who are working on these issues. So again, with the graduate students, they also have their own set of challenges. As I just mentioned, a lack of funding for Black Studies department grads and their research projects, a lack of support for Black femme and Black non-binary folks in academia. The question of interdisciplinarity comes up again and again. Western hemispheric exceptionalism and the exclusion of Africa and a lot of Africana departments, the lack of trained faculty with Black Studies degrees, or the lack of faculty with an interest in the mission of Black Studies to merge the split between the campus and the community life, and concerns about hiring and job market placement, specifically, as I already mentioned, an academic interest in hiring scholars from traditional disciplines, those who are in English or in history or in anthropology, do race or who study Black people as a specific demographic sometimes fare better on the job market than students with Black studies degrees or scholars with Black studies degrees with training in Black studies. The assumption is that those who are in more traditional disciplines can do both or can do more than the Black Studies PhD candidate or the Black Studies PhD holder who can only do Black studies. So then there begins a question of value. How much do we actually value those who study Black studies as a professional career? So some of the recommendations from graduate students, or what graduate students in Black studies want to see based on this survey, is prioritizing the hiring of Black studies PhD holders for tenure track Black studies faculty positions within Black studies departments, establishing a widely accepted national conference where both faculty and graduate students attend en masse so that their work can be heard. And there's not so much of a split between graduate students and faculty conference attendings. I know a lot of Black studies students attend like the American Studies Association, some attend history-based conferences. So there's a large split between where graduate students and where faculty actually go to present their work, producing a generally accepted canon that reflects the breadth of Black studies, and standardizing an undergraduate curriculum, where oftentimes the undergraduate curriculum about Black studies or an intro to Africana studies largely depends on the professor who's teaching it. So it might take more of a historic bend or more of a literature bend. And if it was more standardized, then folks think that perhaps a canon for Black studies would be easier to integrate into the university structure as a whole. One thing I'd like to note as an overarching theme in the graduate student recommendations is that there is a general skepticism of the academy and of the university as a central intellectual space for Black studies and Black intellectual workers. And so part of the conversation is that there are a large number of Black studies scholars who began in the university, who are undertaking a fugitive movement away from the university, who are seeking non-academic jobs in perhaps cultural institutions or in publishing, or perhaps even in organizing spaces where they feel like their intellectual labor is actually valued. So to conclude, I have a few urgent considerations that I think should be addressed, not just necessarily as we continue with a later Q&A session or as we continue to talk among ourselves, but I think generally as it comes to all of our understanding and assessing the state of the discipline in the 21st century. Some of the questions that I think we should address is, what is a canon within contemporary Black studies, and how do those doing different work in the same field coalesce around whatever this mission is, which also brings up the question, what is the mission of Black studies? This would also include dealing with conflicting ideologies within Black studies, questions about how we get free when those ideas differ, and competition around hiring, around publishing, and around notoriety that that academia ultimately enforces upon us. What new historiographies are we developing in common across our disparate interests and fields of research? Frames of reference, what changes in definition are we thinking about? What are our changes of interpretation? What is the Black in Black studies? What constitutes a Black community or a community in general when we talk about Black community, or when we talk about merging the split between community and campus life? Where do we locate and extend the epistemological origin of Black studies? Although we talk about Black studies in the university as beginning with 1960s United States activism, Black study scholarship and Black study as method began way before the 1960s. So how do we locate this, and how do we understand this within a broader Black radical tradition? And lastly, who are we talking to and who are we responsible to when we have these conversations? And how do we cultivate a relevant audience for our work inside and outside of the academy? All of this while being mindful of the extractive relationship the university has had with Black people and with Black studies. So in sum, we have a lot of work to do, and I am excited to be invited to this program of careful listening and consideration and of critical engagement with fellow colleagues of mine, which I hope leads to some sort of consensus around our shared mission and some sort of solution or a plan of action to be applied in our respective institutions and political spaces. I'd like to thank the Stanford University Department of African and African American Studies for inviting me to set the stage for this important event and to provide a little bit of context before the presentations to come. And thank you so much. I thank you all for your time.
All right, well, Melaine, thank you so much for that beautiful overview of the state of the field. I think it's going to really help to stage the conversation that we're going to have next with 4 scholars who are doing Black Studies work either in traditional Black Studies departments or in other departments in which they're incorporating Black Studies theories and methods into their work. And so we're going to begin with some of those. And so I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who is Nnameka. And so Nnameka is a transnational multidisciplinary researcher, artist, educator, and curator from Boston, Massachusetts. He currently lives in Chicago, Illinois, where he is a PhD candidate in the Department of Black Studies at Northwestern University. Nnameka's scholarly and creative interests converge at the intersection of social science, critical theory, creative expression, and political education. His dissertation project on friendship, artistic collaboration, and decolonial Black political thought is an ethnographic, art-based research project that experiments with friendship, artistic collaboration as decolonial research methodologies within the contemporary Black Studies scholarship. Prior to returning to graduate school, Nnameka holds a professional career as an educator and classroom teacher. His teaching philosophy, interpersonal values, and political commitments are a reflection of his academic training in comparative ethnic studies and arts and education, which he received from Columbia and Harvard University. Drawing on theories of Black feminism and Black political thought to interrogate ideas of power, privilege, and personhood throughout art and art making. Nnameka, the stage is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you all for having me. Darion, when I received your invitation, I was in the middle of applying to a fellowship thing and was stressed. I'm like, this idea makes no sense, blah, blah, blah. And so then when I received the invitation to participate in this, it was just an affirmation of stay true, like trust yourself, keep your head down, do good work. So thank you for having me here. And I'm really honored, Melaine. That was an incredible presentation. I'm really excited to get into the Q&A portion of things. So like Darion mentioned, I'm an interdisciplinary scholar and artist. I'm a weaving artist. I also do like sculptural installations and things like that. I'm also an educator and former classroom teacher. So my orientation to Black studies is through the lens of art theory and practice, and also youth and adult development. So thinking about how people learn best and the ways in which art and art making can facilitate that, but also how the culture of conversation around art and art making can also facilitate particular kinds of intellectual growth, but also enhancing our relationships with one another. My project on friendship, artistic collaboration, and decolonial Black political thought kind of stemmed from a couple of things. One, just during the pandemic, really sitting with how much we as a society struggle with the concept of like collective responsibility, but also the ways in which we demonstrated that we have the capacity for it through like mutual aid programs and all that stuff. But then when I was thinking about my dissertation project and how I wanted to kind of think about my experience as a Black Studies grad student, I started thinking about like the way that academia structures learning, particularly this deconstructionist approach to learning, which I think is great in terms of being able to critically engage with ideas, question ideas of truth. But what I noticed in the classroom setting as a graduate student and across other institutions, my friends and my having similar experiences where there was a performance of deconstructionism that was rooted in kind of harsh cynicism and critique that didn't allow for, that kind of discouraged collegiality, that discouraged and it kind of incited feelings of competition and distrust amongst graduate students. And so for me, I got a little concerned about how that dynamic kind of compromised what I believe Black should be, or at least the academic field of Black studies within like higher spaces of learning, like educational spaces or whatever it is. And so I wanted to kind of develop a project to explore and experiment with collaboration and friendship as decolonial research methodologies within the field of Black studies. And so my research questions, there are two primary ones, and then one that's a bonus one that's connected to something I'll talk about in a second. But the first was just to explore and experiment with what are the merits and drawbacks of artistic collaboration as a research methodology within the field of Black studies. So thinking about decolonial kind of thinking or research through the lens of anti-colonial scholar Catherine McKittrick, and how she's encouraging folks to question certain ideas of truth, certain approaches to rigor or empiricism or knowledge and knowledge production. And so really challenging all of us within the field of Black studies to be creative about the ways we think about learning, how ideas are created, and what the possibilities for Black studies scholarship can be in the future. So I was, okay, it would be cool to kind of think about how working with other artists can be a research methodology to explore that through. The other was just to think about the unique experience of friendship and really drawing on my own experiences. I have some really incredible, strong friendships that I feel very blessed to have, many of whom are on the call, which I appreciate you all for being here, and what those dynamics could offer the way I was thinking also about collaboration and working together. And not because friendship is this hokey romantic thing that always feels good, but because it was also my friendships with folks that I feel close to are also rooted in honest conversations, are rooted in a particular kind of rigor, are rooted in particular ethics of care, that alongside thinking about how to work best with each other could really produce some really interesting things. And so the last question was just also thinking about how artistic interpretations of philosophical ideas and debates and questions within the field of Black studies could be enhanced by thinking about, could be enhanced through art and art making. So how approaching these ideas through like visual renderings or artistic renderings of philosophical ideas and debates can help us tap into the emotional register of Black politics. Professor Joy James came to give a lecture at Northwestern recently where she talked about the difference between, in her opinion, Black academic scholars and Black activists outside of academia, and how while there's an overlapping kind of shared interests and concerns around Black life and Black livelihood, that academics fail to kind of hit the emotional register in the way that Black activists do, and was really compelled by that. And I thought art and art making could be a really cool way and a really interesting and insightful way for us to tap into the emotional landscape of Black politics and really get people to feel these ideas beyond just theorizing and thinking about them. So my project, the long and the short of it is, I'm, as a multidisciplinary artist, I'm collaborating with 8 of my friends across 6 different collaborations, and across, and we all represent different kind of representations of the Black diaspora in multiple ways. And so really the goal is in these collaborations to keep track of how we are thinking about our process of collaborating and kind of thinking through certain political ideas and concepts within the field of Black studies, and how our friendships with each other are informing that process, but how the collaboration is also shaping and reshaping our friendship as well. And so the different steps that I've taken in terms of the methodology is, one, I've traveled since 2019 to countries such as South Africa, Ghana, Rwanda, Brazil, Mozambique, and really have interacted with contemporary artists in all those spaces, cultural workers in those spaces. I've done archival data collection in those spaces to just learn a little bit more about how artists and Black thinkers are thinking about relation in those spaces and the power of art and art making, and then using that data and those experiences to then structure some of the collaborations between me and my interlocutors. And so the participant observation is going to be me, is me working with my colleagues and my friends to create things and keeping track of that process. And I'll talk a little bit more about what those specific collaborations have entailed, and then also to incorporating interviews into it as well. So keeping Professor Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot, whose book on portraiture, it's a social scientific methodology that she created, is a really important foundational text for my work, and a methodology that I really admire and have learned a lot from. And she talked about in the process of portraiture, especially when there's no longer a singular voice and disrupting this idea of the singular genius, the singular narrative, that it's really important to have rigorous structures and process to keep you held accountable. And so the interviews are my way of tracking how I'm not only, how my colleagues, my friends are experiencing the collaboration, how we're learning across the process of collaborating with one another. So that was structured at the beginning of the collaboration, in the middle, and the end, to see how we're kind of, how the collaboration is moving us along toward our particular aims. And then the objects that we create, doing visual and object analysis of that. And then my kind of orientation and commitment to autoethnography is rooted in Bell Hooks's, in Paulo Freire, and then Bell Hooks's references of the concept of conscientization. think I'm saying it wrong, but it's a very wordy word, where she's asking us, and they're both asking us to be self-reflective about, as educators, how we are like, how not only we're approaching learning, but how our students are responding to how we're learning. And so for me, autoethnography is a way for me to keep track of, to name my subject position within the research project, and to keep track of how I'm being moved by the experience and how my experiences are being interpreted by my colleagues and peers as well. So these are the different collaborative structures. Each of my collaborative pairings and groupings are not only structured around established friendships between me and my interlocutors, but also around concepts and themes of shared mutual interests. And so I'll get into a little bit more about some of them here. You see them listed here. For example, my collaboration, one of my best friends, Nora, who's an educator at New York University in the urban education program, we're really compelled by the way in which the relationship between friendship and time, and how friendship can slow down time in response to the urgency of white supremacy and capitalist production. And so she and I were on a research trip in South Africa and Mozambique this summer, where we learned of a Southern African term called pole pole, which means go slow it down. And really our colleagues there were telling us, in response to the urgency of white supremacy, capitalism, all these things, that when you go slow, you're more equipped to hear not only yourself speak, but your ancestors speaking through you. And so we really are compelled about how our friendship has held us accountable to that, and the ways in which friendship can shift and reorient our relationship to time. So that's just one example, but I'll show you some of the images. Sorry I'm speaking so fast. I'm just aware of how limited time I have to talk about all this. So I hope this is making sense. So this is some copies, some images of the kind of works that I make. I'm a fiber artist and a sculptor artist. That sculpture on the left is actually a sculpture of my sister. This is the work of Carmen Neely, who's an amazing Chicago-based abstract painter, a dear friend of mine. And through our collaboration, we're actually exploring language and abstraction, but also memory and the concept of negative capability, which is a term that was coined by John Keats, the poet, but Toni Morrison has referenced as well in the past as well. And it's the idea of pursuing beauty toward intellectual confusion. So not necessarily having particular aim, but just really kind of pursuing beauty and being okay with the unknown, and really being able to hold the unknown and uncertainty of things, which I think is a really important practice within Black studies as well. My collaboration with Lishan, who's an amazing photographer and a dear friend of mine, we actually went to undergrad together, so we've been friends for several years now. And she did an underwater photography project in Chicago on Lake Michigan, inspired by the story of Eugene Williams, who was the young man who was killed in 1919 that catalyzed the race riots in Chicago. And so for us, we're engaging in history, but also critical fabulation through photography to think about what the afterlife of what Black people's relationship to water has been, not only through the ways in which white supremacy has structured an antagonistic relationship between Black people and water, but also the pre-colonial relationship that Black people have had with water, and the ways in which that is part of our DNA. And so really using these images and these stories to create a book together that features poetry from different friends and colleagues of ours to have that conversation, but also to explore book art, which has been really fun as well, to create a book together in a really dynamic way. My collaboration with Stephen Hamilton and Shaniqua Brooks. So collaboration with Stephen Hamilton and Shaniqua Brooks, who are dear friends of mine. Stephen is actually the friend who taught me how to weave. I weave on a West African upright loom over there. And so he taught me how to weave. He actually studied weaving. So Stephen is a Black American, identified like American descendant of enslaved folks. And he learned how to weave in Nigeria. And I'm Nigerian American, born in Boston. And he taught me how to weave. We're both from Boston. And so there's this interesting diasporic dialogue happening where he's studying and learning from going to the continent to learn this skill that he's then teaching me here, which has been really interesting. But the three of us together, we have monthly Zoom calls where we just weave and gossip and talk about life and talk about politics and different things. And so our collaboration, we're working on a beautiful costume design together, which is gonna be really kind of incredible, using our different weaving aesthetics. Shaniqua studied weaving in Ghana, and it's from the Caribbean. And so there's this, again, another interesting diasporic conversation happening among all of us representing different cultural aspects of the Black diaspora. And so through this, we're studying, we're not only exploring concepts of Afrophobia, which Melaine, you had talked about in your presentation, which I'm excited to get into more, but also conversations around transnationalism and also environmentalism as well. So trying to amplify the ways in which Black people are already always engaged in environmentalism in different ways out of necessity, kind of because of the way that we're structured to live. And so this particular collaboration is informed by my recent trip to Ghana and Rwanda, where I was studying the ways in which contemporary artists there are incorporating environmental waste into their textile and installation art. And so we're kind of exploring these ideas together. Kane Baum is a really dear friend of mine and is a new friend. So this is a cool part of the collaboration where this is the newest friendship. And so it's interesting to think it's not as established as some of the others and the ways in which the collaboration will shape and inform that as well. But we are exploring perspective, language, abstract sculpture, and really thinking about feedback and incorporating feedback loops, which is something that we talked about recently as well. And then Samor Penderhughes is a dear friend as well, who's a musician I've known since undergrad as well. And he's an abolitionist. If you don't know his work, he's really making a lot of waves just with not only because of his skills and talent as a musician, but his politics also as an abolitionist. And he and I are exploring creating a soundscape together and thinking about what an abolitionist sound like. And then also thinking through ideas of how capitalism and art, the intersection between capitalism and creativity compromises and complicates our relationship to politics as Black people, but also exploring rhythm and blues, affect, different things as well in the concept of time. So those are just some of the different collaborations that I'm working on. The cool part, and to the point, this particular part of the project is not necessarily a part of my dissertation. At least my advisors have been encouraging me to kind of scale it back and have this be like the postdoctoral thing. But I've been invited by the Southside Community Arts Center, which is the oldest, longest existing African-American arts culture institution in the country, to exhibit these objects at the end of this process, which is really exciting. So this is what the main gallery space looks like in Chicago. And so part of my goal in doing this is and reaching out to them and proposing to exhibit the work there was informed by the work of Richard Iden, who's a political scientist, who talked about the ways in which of the different forms of art. He talks about the relationship between art, culture, and politics for Black people, and how it's art is actually an essential way of political organizing for Black people because of the ways in which we're left out of formal politics in the US. And so when he lists the different forms of political efficacy around the arts, he said that visual art is the least politically impactful because of the ways in which it exists in institutions that are kind of detached from where Black people live and stay. And so this exhibiting the work there and then kind of incorporating people's responses and reactions to the work is an important part of this project for me as well and future iterations of the project. Just to give a quick shout out to my committee, I have an all-star dream team that I think has been really supportive and amazing of the work and really supportive and just like instructive in terms of the way I'm approaching the way I'm thinking about this project. So I'm just shouting them out too. These are some of my references of many different references. I have several pages of bibliography that I'm working through, these some texts that I draw on for the ideas that I'm working through as well. And please feel free to be in touch if you have any questions about my work or want to kind of communicate or collaborate further. So thank you for your time. Sorry I was rushing through that. I really just didn't want to make sure I didn't go over time. Thank you.
All right, well, Nnameka, thank you so much for that brilliant presentation. I really love to see the ways in which you're incorporating multiple disciplines in your dissertation project and work, and excited to see where it's going to go moving forward. I want to move us on to the next presenter. So I want to add a spotlight for Zenzile. And so Zenzile is a PhD student at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Her research focuses on the historical and contemporary practice of Black educational self-determination. In her work, she interrogates the ways in which Black educators and families become empowered to exercise leadership and control over educational spaces in their communities. Her research integrates historical and sociological methods, and she most often explores the process and impact of educational self-determination through the lives and strategies of Black women. In 2019, she received her BA in sociology with a minor in history from the University of California, Santa Barbara. While there, she conducted an award-winning research on colonial and anti-colonial educational practices across the African diaspora, as well as the mechanisms of institutional support for low-income and first-generation student success. She's the proud product of African-centered schooling in her hometown of Oakland, California. Zenzile, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Darion. I'm so excited to be here with you all today. My name is Zenzile Riddick. I'm just full of gratitude and awe at my co-panelists at the African American Studies Department at Stanford. And I'm ready to get into it. I talk from the field of Black education studies. That's where I locate my dissertation project and my work. So I'm super excited to talk about this because, when Melaine was talking, we have so many topics that we think of as like core to Black studies, but oftentimes we don't see education and the study of education itself showing up in those lists. So I think this is timely. When you talk about something that's emerging, Black education studies is on the move right now. So without further ado, I'm gonna just share with you all a little bit in the short time that we have about my dissertation project. So let me go ahead and share my slides with you. All right, so we're talking about Black education with this presentation, right? And when I think about Black education, I'm of course reminded of the anti-Blackness that structures dominant schooling systems. I'm reminded of the abhorrent lack of Black educational leadership that we have in dominant schooling systems. I'm very aware of the devaluation of Black families, Black culture, Black heritage in our curriculum and our school practices. But for me, when I'm thinking about Black education, anti-Blackness and dominant schooling structures is just simply not the first thing that comes to mind. As Darion said, I was raised in Oakland, California, and I'm the product of African-centered schooling. I grew up in a school called Ile Omade, which is a Swahili phrase that means house of the children. And at that school, I was blessed to be taught by a staff that was completely composed of Black educators, the vast majority of whom were also parents at our school. And as such, there was not only an expectation, but a requirement that our families were involved in all aspects of our learning. So this, to me, the value of Black educators, their pedagogies, curriculums that are centered upon the Black experience, and very importantly, the equitable inclusion of our Black families, our Black parents, our Black communities in school leadership and decision-making. This is the core of Black education that I came to Harvard to study. So I began to seek out a historical case study that would allow me to perform an in-depth analysis of independent Black education. And in my search, I found St. Joseph's. There we go. In early 1969, Black families and community members began a process of the institutional transformation of St. Joseph's School in Roxbury, Massachusetts. And Roxbury is a Black neighborhood literally in the heart of Boston. As a result of white flight from Roxbury, most white parishioners had abandoned the church and the school, and they'd actually begun advocating for its closure. But for Black families, closing this school was a non-option. Nearly none of these Black families were Catholic. However, they refused to subject their children to inadequate segregated public education. Furthermore, the school building's physical location was in the center of a Black community, rather than outside the community in some suburb that they would have to bus their children to. You see, for these Black families, the ability to send their children to a school that was in their community was a non-negotiable practice of self-determination. So Black families and educators began a strategic coalition building effort to keep the school open, and not only to keep it open, but to transform it completely. And as a result, the Boston Archdiocese actually agreed to hire a Black nun as the principal to help transition the school from Catholic to complete community control. And in the fall of 1969, the school opened with a new philosophy and a new name, St. Joseph's Community School. The parent board that oversaw the school's transformation became an independent corporation in 1972 and would lead the school for a total of 15 years. In the oral histories that I have conducted, St. Joseph's community members have emphasized the heterogeneity of the community that coalesced around the shared goal of quality education for Black children. This coalition began with the leadership of Black parents and families, and through their activism, the coalition expanded to include nuns in the Catholic Church, both white and Black, who heard the calls and cries of families and used their nuanced social locations within the church to take a leading role in securing the necessary resources to meet the family's demands. The coalition expanded further when the nuns realized that they needed innovative teachers and ways to fund teachers' salaries and training outside of the church, at which point they began to develop strategic partnerships with teacher education programs throughout the country, including the Harvard Graduate School of Education, creating both a thriving teaching staff and a training site for educators interested in culturally relevant practice. And as stated as in a 1971 New York Times profile of the school, which I have a picture of here, you see those girls dancing, you see their afros. And that New York Times profile, Blau writes that when these parents, nuns, and educators came together, united by the goal of community-controlled education, quote, a marriage was made. So while the coalition surrounding the school's success was definitely heterogeneous, incorporating people from different walks of life, you have parents who have been in the community for a long time, you have young student educators who are just entering their teacher education program, you have nuns, and most people have never seen a Black nun except on Sister Act, which was not out at this time. This is a heterogeneous group of people who are united around one goal, but it's really important that I highlight what has been highlighted in my oral histories, which is that Black women really played a very central role as stewards of the school's collective leadership. And one of the most impactful leaders of the school, if I had more time, there would be a whole bunch of pictures up here, but I want to focus on one person who has shown up in every single interview, Sister Sylvia Thibodeau. As an educational and religious leader in New Orleans, Boston, and Benin City, Nigeria, Sister Sylvia's commitment to political self-determination, cultural self-definition, and collective leadership helped to facilitate the actualization of community control at St. Joseph's and beyond. A central element of her leadership strategy was developing educational training programs for community members, particularly Black mothers, who wanted to take an active role in the provision of quality education for their children. Sister Sylvia's strategic approach to leadership and professionalization illustrates her commitment to the value of a term that Charles Payne uses called group-centered leadership. He uses this term to discuss the organization strategies of Ella Baker. You know, in an interview that I conducted with sociologist and feminist theorist Patricia Hill Collins, who took her first job after graduate school at St. Joseph's, she explained that while Sister Sylvia was an incredible force, there was, quote, no front person or charismatic leader. All were responsible for the leadership of the school. So this model of collectivism, it really allowed for the incorporation, not just of educators from the community, but of family involvement at all levels of the school's operation. So as a final note, because we have more panelists, I want to talk to you and not a whole bunch of time, I quickly want to touch on the role of family involvement and empowerment at St. Joseph's. Perhaps the most clear representation of family empowerment at St. Joseph's was the leadership of the Independent Incorporated Parent Board, which had the highest level of decision-making ability in terms of school administration, curriculum selection, teacher hiring, teacher firing, any decision having to do with the school. Under the leadership of the parent board, Catholic teachings were completely replaced with culturally relevant curriculum and an emphasis on familyhood and the Nguzo Saba principles as the guiding value system of the school. By placing parents at the highest level of decision-making authority, St. Joseph's disrupted traditional notions of schooling that devalue and exclude Black families, Black histories, and Black cultures. So to conclude, I would like to just evoke the Sankofa, a West African symbol that represents an Akan proverb, meaning to go back and get. As you see, the bird is moving forward, but his head is turned backward to retrieve his golden egg there, which is a representation of wisdom. As we continue to move forward in the pursuit of quality education for Black children, we must never forget the value of retrieving the wisdom from our past and retrieving the historical ethnographic story of St. Joseph's. I hope to unearth the invaluable impact of collective and inclusive leadership, organizing, and the empowerment of families and communities in the realm of Black education. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much for that presentation, Zenzile. It was beautiful from start to finish, and I'm so happy that you are blending history and sociology together to create a new articulation of what Black education is. We're going to move on to our next presenter, which is Jordan. I'm going to add him as a spotlight at this time, as well as introduce him. And so, Jordan is a doctoral student in modern culture and media at Brown University. Previously, he was a Mellon Cluster Fellow in Critical Theory at Northwestern University, where he received an MA in African American Studies in 2022. His thesis, Little's Got a Daddy, Cinematic Affect and Fantasism's Real and Barry Jenkins' Moonlight, reads across the psychoanalytic interventions of Frantz Fanon and David Marriott to critique the effective and phenomenological approaches to the film, which refound the racial fetish of romance and phallation that extends the anti-Black identity of fantasy, reality, and the real. In 2018, he was honored as an Intellectual of the Year at Morehouse College, where he received his BA in English with honors the following year. His research interests broadly engages German Romanticism, psychoanalysis, queer theory, Black aesthetic philosophy, and the sexual afterlives of slavery. He is currently at work on his dissertation, which takes up social death, sexuation, and the Black radical aesthetic tradition to illuminate the intellectual hegemony of queer of color, critique, queer Marxism, and the performance theory collectively hold over questions of Black sexual difference, romance, and erotic possibility. Jordan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Darion, and thank you, everybody, all the co-panelists. I'm just going to try to jump right into it. So let me share this. Yeah, you can see, everyone can see, yeah? Great. As an antisocial queer theorist of racial slavery, I investigate love as part of the assumptive logic and libidinal architecture of anti-Blackness. I look to Martinican psychoanalyst Frantz Fanon, whose diagnosis of how our belief in love operates at the very level of its possibility figures a queer way into his psychopolitics that I want to emphasize and use to analyze the work of contemporary Black sexuality studies, queer of color critique writ large, and the work of late queer theorist Jose Munoz in particular. In his canonical text, Cruising Utopia, The Then and There of Queer Futurity, Munoz references and recuperates the Heideggerian inflection of the possible, Möglichkeit, to in turn pose queerness as the kind of being by which what is potential is utopic. I find Fanon's insinuation of perversion into the temporal paradigm of amorous possibility not only instructive for placing love under a different kind of psychoanalytic examination, but for also interrogating discourses that facilitate faith in the non-fetishistic affiliation of love and time. This requires that I rethink what Munoz calls, quote, a certain liberation of eros that I am describing as not only queerness, as not only queerness, but also a queer utopianism that, again, though not exclusively about gay or lesbian sexuality, certainly embraces experimental modes of love, sex, and relationality. What are the conditions of possibility in a very strict sense for such a queer utopian embrace? To be sure, in his later attempt to conceptualize utopian performance, Munoz considers the pronounced limits of the Heideggerian language of possibility, a limit which, under his analysis, Agamben's Aristotelian elaboration of potentiality appears to prove. However, what might it mean if we want to take seriously what the editor and translator of the Agamben text to which Munoz attempts to turn himself asserts? Quote, Agamben can thus be said to carry out, in its general ontological implications, Heidegger's project to conceive of, and here he's quoting Heidegger, the quiet power of the possible, die stille Kraft des Möglichen, as being itself. What this might also mean for the quote unquote sovereignty of quiet must be bracketed for later. As for Munoz, he articulates a theory of queer life that embodies the simultaneity of what could be now and what is not yet here, the existentially possible and the ontologically potential on the mutually Aristotelian basis of Heidegger and Agamben. Queerness in this framework registers its being as becoming, where becoming is as such a queer way of being possible in that Heideggerian sense of being, the very possibility of authentic existence. And you can see the quote, that Heidegger quote there for reference. From here, we can say that being queer just is this endless attempt to, quote, recognize we inhabit the end in every repetition, that the end is everywhere around us, end quote. These last words I take from political theorist Baudor Allegra, who proposes a politics that interrupts the interminable and, quote, breaks with the meter so that the world may begin again and again, but from what she calls the academic gestures of Black revolutionaries this time. Nonetheless, likewise, the death that discloses Dasein defines less of an end in itself, which it infinitely anticipates, and more of its very capacity to be already ahead of itself, to quote Heidegger. That is, already at an end, in and with the end, or invoking Allegra again to, quote, understand that the terminal is already here. This is exactly what Heidegger means when he defines anticipation as equiprimordial with Dasein's potentiality for being. Therefore, there is no discrepancy in Heidegger between inhabiting the end, as Allegra purports, and being towards a possibility, as he himself says, which is also how he defines being towards death. It is Dasein for whom existence or the potentiality for being is the projection into a future understood as finite, and the German word for finite here is endlich, like endlich, and therefore indefinite. Rifting on Allegra once more, the end indeed is everywhere around Dasein as its own most truth, or what it inhabits and actualizes ad infinitum. I take this philosophic detour through what Allegra is calling the interminable to demonstrate that what is at stake is not only utopia as a queer temporality. Rather, I'm curious about how Heideggerian time in particular and temporality as such comes under the theoretical auspices of queer of color critique as a way to place queer theory in proximity to left political purposes without much consideration of time's unanticipated fascism or anti-Black infrastructure. Might it benefit both Black studies and queer of color critique to recall that it is within the fatherland in decline that Hölderlin also theorizes the possible as that which, quote, enters into actuality and does so precisely as the actuality is dissolving. And I think there's a lot of literature on Hölderlin's importance to German fascism that we could probably talk about. Is such an intellectual inheritance or conceptual compatibility to be overlooked? To the contrary, this is where I find Fanon most useful. With love as leitmotif, what perverts possibility for Fanon, and we should hold on to the psychoanalytic intonations of that term, is how the sheer possibility of love in the colony straddles one across nothingness and infinity, the not yet here and the not yet and the already here. Anti-Blackness names the very temporal configuration of a fate that is never final and therefore neither found, forgotten, nor foregone, only performed infinitely as fatal fantasy. I am less concerned with identifying Munoz's theory of time as in itself totalitarian, to whatever extent that it is Heideggerian. Rather, I want to attend to the way queer time in and along its utopian register can philosophically tend toward or covertly facilitate reproductive technologies of extermination by neglecting how Heidegger avails a heuristic for ontology and temporality that mutually animates queer of color critique and studies of Black sexuality and politics. As it turns out, this will have everything to do with Black love as it politically reemerges in an era in which Black flesh is purported to potentiate, make possible, and perform erotic and illegible or erotic as illegible grammars of refusal and resistance. Here, I'm thinking of how the many moves to read for pleasure as a privatized source of intramural power on the plantation not only attempts to close a necessarily open question offered by the work of Hortense J. Spillers, but moreover, erotically reentrenches the plasticized humanity of the slave precisely by making, quote, the interior lives and erotic subjectivities of enslaved Blacks matter, to quote Trevor Lindsay and Jessica Marie Johnson. Such an approach, whose popularity has only seemed to pick up speed, fails to read for how sex and sexuality are only made material through the infinite malleability of the Black body. Of course, here I'm pulling from the work of Zaki and Jackson. What good is erotic capital, a term Lindsay and Johnson uses, what good is the putative pleasure and the provisional reprieve pulled from and placed in scenes of sexual negotiation if, as libidinal economist Tasia McDougall has demonstrated, quote, Blackness comes to stand as monetary because it is the representation of a debt that is structurally and necessarily unpayable. We might ask a certain strand of Black feminist theory, can a slave engage in sex work? Or what is the difference between Black sex and a sexuality for sale? I want to argue that if we follow Fanon, we find in work on the sexual afterlives of slavery quite Munosian assumptions about the queer futures or erotic freedoms contained in Black sexual life. These necessarily fail to confront or detect the perversity Fanon tells us remains present on the always already amorous register of the possible, a register on which Blackness becomes the sexual currency of queer life. In its uncritical reception of queer of color critique, Black sexuality studies leaves unexamined how love relates to time and how the possible condition for such a relation relies on anti-Blackness. For some, the future is not merely foreclosed, For some, the future is not merely foreclosed, negated, or cruel. It is fatal in its seductive and abysmal infinitude. Which is neither good nor bad, progressive or spurious, but rather absolutely unassimilable. This is also to say that it has been primarily through or alongside the language and assumptive logics of disidentification and utopia that we have come to theorize Black sexuality in slavery's long term as either proof of interiority, reservoir of ecstasy, or strategy for sexual self-determination. Such intellectual prerogatives, I argue, further the genocidal vitalism of sexual difference, erotic love, and everyday romance. And this formula of genocidal vitalism I owe to the work of Ixel Carrera and Dixa Ramirez de Leon. By finding queer futures in fugitive fungibility, we have flirted with fascism, refound slavery as romance, and confused sexual performance for erotic agency. This line of inquiry comes partly out of a curiosity regarding the citational celebrity of Munoz in Black sexuality studies. And we can think of the work of Jafari Allen, Jana Brown, Darius Bost, Margot Crawford, Kara Keeling, Tavia Nyong'o, to name a few. Furthermore, few, if any, have stopped to consider the ethics of a non-Black scholar who, throughout his oeuvre, accomplished his theoretical formulations through Black figures, real and fictional. These considerations, in fact, have only found affirmation in the singular eloquence of queer aesthetic theorist Ren Ellis-Nera, who writes in a rigorous review of the posthumous publication of Munoz's The Sense of Brown, quote, Blackness is not a position in Brownness's semiotic world, but material for its becoming. Taking Nera instructively, I draw this connection between Munoz and Black sexuality studies to highlight another line of intellectual inheritance that constitutes how Black love, or the politics of love in Black studies, is being presented today in ways that, for the sake of erotic sovereignty or queer sexuality, mystify how, as Zakiya Iman Jackson tells us, anti-Blackness itself is sexuating. Ultimately, my aim is to clarify how such a mystification makes manifest Black love in its complicity with imperial power. Let me conclude by way of inquiry and example. What is the coincidence? What is in the coincidence that before writing in her award-winning book, Black Feminism Reimagined After Intersectionality, quote, the possibility of rooting Black feminist love politics and law is work that expresses a fundamental faith in law's capacity to perform different kinds of justice work, even as it recognizes how law is often mobilized as an agent of inequality and justice. Renowned Black feminist Jennifer Nash, again, prior to such a definition of Black feminist love politics in her first monograph, unwittingly inherits via Munoz another Heideggerian concept, which we heretofore have not addressed. Quote, drawing on Jose Munoz's conception of ecstasy as an invitation, a call to a then and there, and not yet here, a collective potentiality, I use ecstasy, she continues, as a corrective to injury and as a critical response to a Black feminist tradition that offers an opportunity to, quote, and she's quoting Munoz here again, step out of the here and now, of the logic of injury emphasized by Black feminist visual culture studies, and to embrace the potential of doing Black feminist visual culture studies and implicitly Black feminist politics differently, of organizing around the paradoxes of pleasure rather than woundedness or the elisions of shared injury, around possibilities rather than pain. How might Munoz's framework help Nash and Black feminism in general move love toward the law, if, as we see here, there is no contradiction detected between ecstasy in her former work and empire in her later work, collective potentiality and juridical power, love and the law? Where with this does love end and state violence begin? Is abolition a love language, or is romance a metonym for murder? Intimacy a metaphor for a mutilation? Thank you, everybody.
Jordan, I see all of the applause that are coming through the screen as well as in the chat. And so I want to say thank you for a beautiful demonstration of not just how to talk about Black people in research, but to rigorously and deeply theorize Blackness in your research and in your scholarship. And so I'm going to say thank you once again, and I'm going to introduce our last speaker for the evening. Okay, so our last speaker for the evening is Jameelah, who is a PhD candidate in social and cultural anthropology at Stanford University. She received her BA in international relations and Spanish from Tufts University and MA in anthropology from Stanford University. At Stanford, Jameelah co-founded the Black Studies Collective and the Latin American Working Group, and was also a co-organizer of the Concerning Violence Collaborative Research Group. Her research interests include anti-Black state violence, Black political mobilization, youth political cultures, racialized geographies, digital media, and urban displacement. Her dissertation research investigates the impacts of state violence on Black communities and responses to them across generations in Colombia. Against the backdrop of neoliberal tourism development in Cartagena, it examines gendered anti-Black state violence and intergenerational social movements as processes that produce Black youth and Black political subjects. Her work has been supported by the Social Science Research Council and Fulbright Hays program. Jameelah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Darion, and thank you everyone for joining. I'm in my advanced years, I'll say, here at Stanford, and I am so happy and grateful for all of the work that it has taken and commitment that it has taken to get us to have this kind of space to talk about Black studies and the urgency of Black studies as a department, especially here at Stanford. So I'm going to share my screen, and what I will be doing today during the short time, or hopefully short time, that I have to present today is one of the central frameworks of my overall dissertation. And my dissertation, which I will summarize more fully towards the end, investigates the impacts of state violence on Black youth and communities against the backdrop of neoliberal tourism development on the Caribbean coast of Colombia. Methodologically, it draws on 18 months of ethnographic, collaborative, and archival research in collaboration with longstanding intergenerational and youth-led Black organizing groups in Cartagena to examine responses which articulated generationally to the myriad forms of Black subjugation that produced imaginations of paradise. In doing so, I developed generations as a framework to understand how Black communities experience, theorize, and respond to the time of anti-Black state violence, which is what I would like to briefly introduce today. Over the past decade, Black communities across the Americas have mobilized as political subjects, demanding and securing the formal recognition of territorial, political, and economic rights for ethno-racial communities. And while these advancements represent a crucial break in the racial democracy tradition of the region, it is important to recognize that these achievements have been accompanied by persistent and routinized state terror, resulting in gratuitous violence and premature Black death. In other words, Black death persists as the terms and conditions of recognition and inclusion of Black life in the region, and the grounds upon which the discourses of multiculturalism, diversity, and inclusion are made possible. It is a particularly constitutive element of what Kristen Smith conceptualizes as gendered anti-Black necropolitics that necessitates Black death as the condition of possibility for the management of life, intentionally targeting Black communities, leaving lingering and layered trauma in the wake of anti-Black state violence. Extending a long line of Black feminist anthropological scholarship that has accompanied, struggled alongside, and collaborated with Black political organizing in Latin America, the demands for Black life that Black communities mobilize require more than simple adjustments to existing state institutions. In this context, my research puts these Black feminist anthropological scholars on state violence and the production of paradise and racialized geographies into conversation with broader Black studies theorizations on temporality and the concept of generations in historical time, mainly a conception of historical time that is recursive and not linear. In doing so, my project seeks to understand how the relationship between paradise and violence shows up in these different discussions and the extent to which this relationship plays a role in the politics of Black citizenship and the stakes of Black survival in the Americas across generations. For example, my project takes up Kristen Smith's theorization of Afro-paradise, which she theorizes as the deathly dialectic between the glorified representation and gratuitous killing of Black people as two sides of the same coin as that which produces paradise. Importantly for my project, Afro-paradise provides a crucial and important break in a longstanding analysis of Black presence in the Americas that reduces analyses of Black presence in the analysis to simple frameworks of inclusion and exclusion. Rather than presuming that different forms of representation of often folkloric visual assemblages of Black communities or legal inclusion in the state's multicultural framework as what evidences the long strive for accomplishment of Black citizenship, her theorization of Afro-paradise asks us to consider what are the logics, projects, and values that are cohered through Black presence, logics, projects, and values that are most certainly anti-Black and often deadly. Since the 1950s, the geographic distance of Colombia's Caribbean coast from the violence of the armed conflict, violence largely presumed to only be in territories and cities in the country's interior and Pacific coast, has produced an imaginary of the city of Cartagena as a land of peace and of paradise, fueling the rapid development of the region's tourism economy. State and internationally owned tourism companies market Cartagena as a city with a combination of beaches, colonial architecture, and adorned fruit-selling Black women from the historic Maroon community of San Basilio de Palenque in order to invite touristic enjoyment of the tropical landscape. But this imaginary of paradise is undoubtedly sutured by a deathly dialectic. Black political mobilizations in Cartagena have named how the emergency of anti-Black police violence, which disproportionately targets Black youth in the state abandonment of predominantly Black neighborhoods, combine into economic peril across the city as things that evidence the contradictions constituted in the imaginary of paradise. But how could this be when Colombia's Ministry of Commerce, Industry, and Tourism market the city of Cartagena as the home of happy Black women that will show tourists that, quote, Colombia will make you feel just like home? These contradictions demonstrate how dual representations of racial inclusion and gratuitous gendered anti-Black state violence operate jointly to produce Cartagena as a paradise. Indeed, social science scholars have extensively examined how tourism geographies deepen already existing economic disparities and racial, gender, and class inequalities to produce paradisical imaginaries. The contradictions of paradise raise important questions about who paradise is and can be for. These contradictions are known, experienced, and responded to by the people used to make paradise possible. And yet paradise remains antithetical to those same people. Thus, in this context in which Blackness is both extractable value for an ever-growing tourist economy and gratuitously killed object, Blackness is constituted beyond an economy of expendability. It is one of accumulation where Blackness can be both of important symbolic value and a site of gratuitous Black death, which is constitutive of the state's approach to Black communities, not only in Colombia, but throughout the hemisphere, in ways that joins Colombia in a transnational continuum of anti-Black state violence as that which interdicts the terms of Black citizenship. The white ideal of a nonviolent space constituted in paradise is made possible not only by the gendered anti-Black violence sustaining the paradise, but also that which it purports to eradicate. In this context, I offer the idea that paradise is parasitic in a structural sense. In tracing the generations of Black political action from the early neighborhood-based struggles for livable infrastructure to later movements for the right to be in public space, I draw attention to the retrenchment of the parasitic relationship of paradise and argue that this retrenchment affects the way Black political action is envisioned intergenerationally, as people's conception of their temporal experience is irreducible to the condition of their time. Anti-Black state violence then is palimpsestic in a historical sense and also collective in its deleterious lingering effect on Black communities. In this sense, my project thinks alongside Kristen Smith's theorization of sequela, which theorizes the lingering trauma of anti-Black state terror as an intentional aspect of state violence that kills Black mothers and Black communities over time. My project builds on this work to argue that this lingering also renders the time of anti-Black state violence. I do so by drawing on David Scott's approach to generations as a way to analyze the afterlife of events, to foreground my project's theoretical focus on how Black communities experience and respond to the time of state violence, and how state violence disrupts genealogical time, mainly in a human developmental sense, in turn. I namely take up Deborah Thomas's conception in Political Life in the Wake of Emancipation, that Black subjects experience contemporary life as co-temporal with slavery, marked by, quote, a palimpsestual repetition of events, unquote, that generate a sense of continuity between slavery, post-emancipation periods, and contemporary life, in order to inquire the ways the ruins are never newly assembled, but palimpsestually arranged. I ask this question in the context of an intergenerational social movement wrestling not only with the interdiction of the multiple rights guaranteed through Columbia's Law 70, which was Columbia's law, multicultural law that guaranteed territorial, political, and educational rights to Black communities, but they're wrestling with the question of if the conceptual arsenal of multiculturalism, rights, and state recognition could ever fully attend to the layered and lingering suffering anti-Black state violence instantiates. In this sense, my project looks at the way they attempt to create another terrain of possibility. In this sense, my project asks that we turn towards the affective dimensions of political organizing to bring into question the narrative periodization of collective action, of the markers that typically mark an end, success, or failure of political struggle. To think the temporal dimensions of lingering in the afterlife of anti-Black state terror that Smith's theorization of sequela indexes, alongside the interventions into the linear presumptions of generation that David Scott and Deborah Thomas's critiques of periodization mobilize, my project asks about the implications of the time of anti-Black state violence, its palimpsestual recursivity, for how we might understand its impact on genealogical time. Part of my dissertation asks this question in relationship to the category of age, a category that is normatively mobilized to make a claim to humanity and therefore of justice in the wake of police killings of Black youth and Black children across the Americas. And I'm happy to speak more about this during Q&A. But my dissertation is trying to wrestle precisely with the multiple temporalities that anti-Black state violence both coheres and interdicts, mainly by taking up the ways these theorizations lead us to understanding how the time of anti-Black state violence both lingers and is layered. The lingering, which is instantiated by the reiterative and retrenched forms of policing and forced displacement that produce paradise over time, that in very real ways interdict the ability of Black communities to create the different terrain of possibility for future generations. This lingering is layered in the recursive and the retrenched time of anti-Black state violence, is not only instantiated at the level of the conditions of possibility for the city's progress, but at the level of youth's lives that brings into question the conceptual arsenal of human development, so often mobilized by the city, nation, and political organizations themselves to make claims about the shape and possibility of Black citizenship. Thinking Black feminist anthropological approaches to anti-Black state violence and theorizations on Black temporality and generations, then, My project advances generational study as an analytical form for examining the impacts of the construction of paradise on Black communities across time, while interrogating the linear teleologies of progress in the concept of generations itself. I draw on a definition of generations as social institutions of time and the conceptualization of aspiration put forth by Deborah Thomas as a Black prophetic tradition of reactivating the affective determination to carry on in face of the infrastructures of violence that persist. I use a generational analysis to unveil the ways Black political action has exposed the manifold forms of Black subordination and objection, producing state imaginaries of paradise across time. As such, my project is guided by the following questions. What is the time of gendered anti-Black state violence? How does state violence shape Black communities across generations? And finally, how does gendered anti-Black state violence produce a problem to the presumption of genealogical time and normative conceptions of the child and youth as key figures in generational relations? And I will close it here. And again, thank you all for being here today.
Okay, thank you so much for that presentation, Jameelah. We are getting ready to move into the Q&A. But before we do that, I want to invite one more person to the fore. And I want to introduce Dr. Aileen Robinson, who's going to be a co-moderator during the Q&A and also offer some discussant remarks for all the presentations today. So Dr. Robinson is a historian of performance and technology with specializations in 18th and 19th century British theater and Black cultural performances. Working across the history of science, technology, and theater, Dr. Robinson explores how systems of knowledge connected to the body and the object overlap to produce practices of research, dissemination, and evaluation. She teaches across the history of science and performance, magic and technology, 18th and 19th century stagecraft, and 19th and 20th century Black artistic production. Dr. Robinson, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. I would love for everyone to put in the chat or put in the, one of the reactions, just another round of virtual applause for these wonderful, absolutely stunning panelists. So just thank you for your words, your energy, your meditations that bring us here tonight, that help us think forward. What I'd love to do to give time for us to ask questions, to think on, is I'd love to offer a few of the things that I see coming together. There are many things that we can talk more about, and I want to take those up in our Q&A. But there's a few things that I just want to kind of hold in this meditative space that we have together, that you have all brought to us. First, I want to think about relationality and the networks of material, the networks of care, the networks of family, both chosen, both given, both taken, and both imagined. That this kind of relationality that have produced questions of love, and love that is itself also a challenge. Love that we then need to sometimes challenge. Love that is itself maybe palimpsestic, right? It is the thing itself that maybe we need to be asking more questions about. It is, and also as we think about relationality and these different modes of relationality that you've all offered, I think about our inheritances as those who have come to the academy for a variety of different reasons, brought here. What do we then need to acknowledge and acknowledge anew for the future and acknowledge anew for the past? How do we think and take this relationality, a creative rethinking, a weaving to think about the structure, a reimagining of the ways in which we bring our ideas and our concepts together, not only to be ourselves leaders and thinkers, but also to be students and to be listeners and to be learners? And how do we continue to hold those things throughout our careers, wherever they may lead us? How do we think about the collectivity that brings us into spaces like these, the collectivity that asks us to ask deep and generous and very difficult questions about our lives, about the lives of those we care about, and also about the lives of those who we center in our research. How do we honor them? How do we honor them through our arguments, through our debates, through our agreements, and how do we also center them? How do we center the rich and diverse and absolutely vibrant Black life that is at the center of all of our questioning and our questing? How do we come to find and to acknowledge the ways in which pleasure can hold pain and the ways in which we can rectify that pain through particular types of holding space, of holding each other? How do we also acknowledge the ways in which disciplines come together, and those disciplines are things we hold, we continue to hold while making space for others to find care, for making space for others to have moments of rest, also as we find rest? And how do we do this? And I'm thinking too about the invocation, right? The invocation that we may not all agree all the time about how to move forward, but what does it mean to move forward together with difference? What does it mean to move forward with ideological conversations that allow us to be critically generous, to be critically collaborative, to bring together the arts, the humanities, the sciences, all of the tools for a new reimagining, a new conceptualization of time that rethinks and reimagines where we can go. You've all offered these amazing ways to think forward, and I'd love to sit with you and think about that. So I'm gonna end there with some of those thoughts, but I'd love to hear, I have a question about method and interdisciplinarity, and I would love to think about, have you all think with me on this. And this is kind of going about the intertextuality and interdisciplinary of your projects, and specifically, you're drawing together really important things and bringing out really essential things for us to discuss. What has been the most surprising collision for you in your work? What is the most intertextually, intermethodologically, interdisciplinarily? What has been that collision for you that has brought that your work to a certain kind of query? And I'll leave that open for you to get us started.
Well, I can start. I think I'll start with answering the part of your question that's about like what was most surprising in seeing the work, what collisions did I never expect to see, and how has that shaped my understanding of interdisciplinarity. So I think sometimes when you are, as we all are through our identities and our experiences close to our work, there's a different level of individual rigor that you have to apply to yourself as a researcher, especially me working as a historian, to be careful not to implement your own, or to have your own experiences and your own biases color the way that you're understanding your participants, that you're understanding the archives, not reading your own story, close as it may be, as the story that's being presented before you. And it's difficult work. I think being raised in a school site that has a lot of similarities to the one that I'm studying, I expected that everything would be the same. And immediately I can tell you right now, when I came to the story, how I came to it was being in Roxbury, moving here and saying, I want to honor this community that I'm living in and try to find a story that's connected in my temporary home here. And everyone was saying, look about St. Joseph's, look about St. Joseph's. And I was like, y'all are talking about a Catholic school. That doesn't have anything to do with what I'm doing, you know. The moment that key players were nuns and was this church that, you know, the Black church is something that's deeply a part of how we understand Black studies, the strength of Black institutions. And there's almost no scholars. Things are changing now with the work of like Shannon Williams, building on some other scholars, but people don't consider Catholicism when they're thinking about the Black church or Black operations within the church or Black power. And I had this cognitive dissonance at first. I'm like, this doesn't make sense. I'm looking at these nuns and you're telling me Black power. But what I learned through the research, I was recognizing that one, I had taken on, without even realizing it, these false notions of cultural authenticity and what Blackness and authentic or articulation of Black power ideology might look like in a space. And two, I had underestimated the power of our liberationist ideologies and where they touch us. Something that has come up so much when I'm talking to my participants is, it didn't matter where you were, whether you were the barber down the street or the baker down the street or the new student who had just moved to Boston to come to the ed school, whatever it was, Black power is touching you where you are. This is the movement. It is a part of your life and your life experience. And it doesn't matter what church you're part of, what clothing you wear. It was touching everybody at that time in different ways and moving their actions. So I think that was something that surprised me and helped me kind of break down, I would write and talk about cultural authenticity, but I didn't even realize the ways that I was embodying it in my own framework. And then when you talk about interdisciplinarity, I mean, that is how I ended up at a school of education. That is how we end up in programs of Black studies. Coming to this work, I mean, I must have started in political science, and then I was undeclared, and then it was sociology, and then you add the minor in history. But throughout that entire time, I was a Black studies major, right? Doubling up with all these things, trying to figure out what is the one thing that's going to help me really understand and read this and ground me. And you realize that the Black experience can only be read when you accept the fact or understand the fact that you have to come at it at all lenses. Blackness is as vast as the ocean. If you're going to study the Black experience, you have to understand how art touches us. You have to understand how production touches us, social experience, political experience, sexualities, oppression, all of these systems have to be looked at from different grounding points. And so I just, there's no way, a lot of folks will say Black studies is anti-disciplinary. It's before and beyond, and so that's just, I will stop there, but I could go on and on about the surprises that have come from this historical ethnography.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Anyone else want to jump in for that?
I'll say something really quickly. So I was at African American Studies at Northwestern, and there was a kind of abrupt transition from that program to the program I'm in now. And I think when we want to talk about interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity or interdisciplinarity, I think it's really important to know what we mean when we say discipline. And I think that what I would invite everyone to think about is how precisely in these institutions that have turned toward being transdisciplinary or undisciplinary, that they have done that on the basis of being very disciplinary, right? Like that this kind of turn to the undisciplined and the transdisciplined, and these are terms that are predicated on very disciplinary regimes and very disciplinary forms of education. So again, like I can't take it as true when sociologists or historians tell me something about being transdisciplinary, because I'm asking, okay, yeah, this is a desire, but how are you executing that desire, right? Like, how are you actually acting on it? And what we often see, what I've often seen is, it's history, but with a kind of twist. It's sociology or ethnography with a twist. It's anthropology with a twist. And I think if we're going to be honest about our terms, we have to be honest about our terms, and therefore make sure that when we're saying we're undisciplined, we're not just saying it, but that we're actually practicing something that is getting outside of the discipline. And I don't think that that's going to occur within a college or a university. So I think that the undisciplined is something that happens in the streets. I don't think that the undisciplined and transdisciplined, I don't think that that happens here. I think that we're all kind of performing different kinds of disciplinary modes and trying to work with them. and maybe that's what we mean when we say transdiscipline or interdiscipline. But yeah, anything besides that, I'm not too sure about. I think that still relies on the disciplinary always.
I'll just jump into and just I think to your question, there more so than surprise, I think it's felt affirming, I guess. Just thinking about the relationship between, for example, being a classroom teacher, intellectual conflict and disagreement is an essential part of the learning process. So when I came to grad school and the grad seminar space was a space where that was seen as like personal antagonism versus like, part of the learning process was challenging for me. And I think being in these collaborative pairings and groupings where we don't agree on things creatively all the time and how we're able to massage and work through them and arrive at somewhere that's actually even more profound than what each of us individually could contribute to the ideas that we were trying to advance individually has been really affirming around just like the importance of conflict as a necessary catalyst for learning and growing and all these things too, especially just drawing on Black feminist ideas of difference and interdependence and how we have to negotiate personhood through that. So I feel like that's been great. And then also too, just the affirmation, the point I brought up in my presentation around the relationship between friendship and time, it affirmed and was surprising to me and know that we arrived at that point because it was affirming around just the personal and political. We were working on a conflict abstract and we were both having really rough days, but we're trying to get everything done, and didn't feel like we had time to like name the fact that we were just struggling personally. And so by actually slowing down and naming that like something's off here, we're not doing all right, what's going on, talking through that particular, like those hard feelings actually arrived us at the point of the friendship and time thing. And so I think just like being able to slow down and recognize that our personal experiences inform the things that we do academically, politically, while also keeping in mind what Zenzile was saying too about being mindful of when your personal experiences also color the things, your expectations and outcomes as well, is really important. So I think that's how I would respond to the question.
I'll just add a short bit on interdisciplinarity. I have found, especially in grant applications, that it is almost fetishized in very empty ways, right, to be interdisciplinary, that forces people who are in anthropology or formal disciplines who attempt to articulate interdisciplinarity when it's not there. And there is a mistake that happens in that articulation to equate interdisciplinarity with reading widely, or to equate interdisciplinarity with having different methods, and to the point where we lose what exactly we're ever trying to say when we desire to do an interdisciplinary project. And I think it connects for me with one of the things that I was maybe not surprised about in developing my research topic, but grateful for, which was the very small community we have been trying to build around Black studies at Stanford. And not trying to enforce upon it interdisciplinarity, especially as a field that we're trying to cultivate at Stanford ourselves, but the ways that having those conversations with people in different disciplines changed the way we asked the questions that we were asking. And I think outside of kind of the boundaries of disciplinarity and transdisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity, I have found myself much more interested in the ways these different conversations shape how I ask certain questions and to whom am I asking those different questions.
I think to follow up briefly on this, and the word collision is something that I was kind of struggling with because I don't think I found any collisions exactly, but I think especially when thinking about grants, I've had issues with the phrase original research, and I think I don't know, the thing about Black study for me is like knowing that you come from a certain tradition or you come from a certain intellectual genealogy, and for me it's come with the understanding that there really is no original. There is no anything that I could bring a new idea maybe or a new way of thinking about it, but it's probably not even new. It's probably just not been heard as much. So I guess on the question of interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, is that really, I feel like all that I'm doing through my research is either revisiting or reopening something that was already assumed to be an enclosure, and inviting the story to kind of unfold into another one. And through that, it automatically becomes a different origin point or a different point of departure for a different perspective or for the story to be told in a different way. Um, and a lot of that happens in silence. For me, it's not so much as a collision or an aha moment as this has already been here. It's always been here. And it kind of took the person who's doing the assessment or the interpretation or the evaluation to kind of let everything settle. Um, and kind of let it speak for itself.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I think let's take a minute to, I would love, and also in the chat, if you have a question, please put it in there. I want to make sure that, all voices can come into the space. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Yes, I think it's interesting to think about defining our terms in this sense, right? And I actually want to go to this, the provocation you gave us, Melaine, at the top in your opening state of the field, which really kind of helped set the stage for the kind of conversations we're having, right? And I'd like to go to this query you posed to us about this, let's call it this project, yeah, this project. And I would love for you all to kind of offer what you think you would like. What kind of thing do you want to, from your work, are you hoping to see newly in this project? We've been talking, and by that I mean, so many of you have articulated questions of decoloniality or an unmaking or a type of unmaking. And I'd love to hear about how that is kind of coming into this kind of project as we think of the academy. And take that any direction you want to take that in, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Whoever would like to take that up. And again, any questions in the chat or to me directly.
I think for me, I'm mostly concerned with just how we relate to each other and just the ways in which our ideas build upon one another. And so my goal is just in terms of what I'm hoping my work will contribute to the project of Black Studies is to think about the ways that we can build collective theorizing, collective responsibility, those kinds of things, which again, to Melaine's point, is nothing new. Is just thinking about them in new ways. I love the Audre quote, "There are no new ideas under the sun, only new ways of making them felt," which is why I feel like I'm drawn to art and art making as a way to explore new ways of imbuing these ideas with feelings, and then getting us to think about our individual experiences more collectively as well. So that's my most immediate response, is just thinking about relationships like that. That's really, and love. Love is like the center of everything that I care about. And I think as it relates to Black people as well. So that's my response.
I think originally when I wanted to pursue a doctorate to do in-depth analysis of Black leadership and Black-led education, the initial desire was, I felt that not enough people knew. I felt that when I went into community, there was a lot of hopelessness around our educational opportunities, and I wanted to kind of shine a light on alternate possibilities, alternate spaces, what it meant to engage in space making, the fact that we have made something out of nothing so many times, made something out of everything so many times, and to kind of empower people to feel like, as my participants always say, any family can do the complex work of leading and creating a school. I wanted to make those stories front and center because I thought my school was the only one until I was exposed to the work of Russell Rickford, Carol D. Lee, Elizabeth Todd Breland. So I kind of at first was coming at it, and the way that I think a lot of researchers come at their work, awareness, like, I want people to know this, I want people to feel this. And having been a graduate student during COVID, during one of, if not the most extreme shocks to the public dominant education system that we've seen in this country and beyond, I recognize that this continual moment of crisis with learning, with schools, with parents feeling disconnected, it's at a state of, it's always been urgent, but it's gotten so much more urgent when I see, like, we homeschool my sister back home, and the rise in Black homeschooling during COVID was exceptional. I think went from 4% of Black families were homeschooling to like 11 in a year. That is a lot of people that have decided to fully remove. Once they're seeing what's happening in schools, they say, I won't engage with this anymore. And so I think now what I want my project to do, and still connected to that original hope, but I've been learning a lot about history that speaks to the future, thinking about history as a means to understand our way forward. And I guess I just want new mental models. I think in my community, like when people think about education in Oakland, the mental model is that kid's not going to make it. That school's not going to help them. And these things, I want people to have new mental models of thinking of what a school can be, who can lead their schools, while also recognizing, right, that these alternate schooling programs, at the end of the day, no matter how much we write about them or how many we build, the vast majority of our Black children are going to be in public schools because of everything that it takes to sustain an independent space, finances, resources. And so I also want this to be a toolkit kind of for Black educators and leaders in public education, right? My advisor is Dr. Jarvis Givens, and he recently published a book, Fugitive Pedagogy, about the ways during slavery and after slavery that, even with the surveillance of white supremacy, that Black teachers have engaged in ways to undermine white supremacist notions of education and give their children a real education that they could hold on to. And a lot of times when we think about that, it's only in the segregation context. So I want to show people, hey, we don't have to be back then to engage in these fugitive practices. And teachers know they're doing it every day, but it's kind of like, as much as as many images and as many narratives that we're getting about not being able to teach our children the way that we want, we need to get just as much, if not more, information about the way that we can, the way that we constantly do. So I guess that's what I want. I just want educators and families to feel hopeful about their children, because at the end of the day, you can talk about, like the world is done and it's no more that we can do. And then you look in the eyes of a 4-year-old, you can't say that to that child. You can't deny that child the right to live, to learn, to grow. And so I think that's kind of what I want to come from the work. That was kind of a mouthful, but.
I can go. I think what I would like my work to do is reflective of kind of how I came to Black Studies, which wasn't in search of anything, but was more so trying to make sense of several personal and political things that had been unresolved over time. And I wanted to have the space intellectually and personally to deal with the unresolvability of those things. And a lot of the unresolvability had to do with how sometimes the very language, a lot of the kind of Black activist circles I was a part of in DC, where I was born and raised, were using terms and categories that ended up doing us some kind of a disservice, that didn't complete the vision, or that somehow challenged and put our vision of what we wanted to move forward to, and to bring Black life and livability into being, into crisis. And a lot of my work, and especially as a project that works in collaboration with Black social movements, isn't invested in overstating what's happening, but is very much interested in the kind of language that's used to try and make sense or make certain claims to Black life. At the same time that those language and categories ultimately kind of subscribe Black life in different ways and towards an orientation towards death. And so I struggle with this question, because my answer is not one of a futurity understood in a traditional sense. I want my project to ask us to ask different questions about the life and death stakes of mobilizations for Black citizenship. And I think if my work achieves our ability to ask different questions and to interrogate the terms that we use when we ask those questions, then my project has done its job.
Thank you. Yeah. And I think, please, Melaine, please.
Oh, no, please go.
Oh, no, please jump in.
I was gonna say this is a tough question. I'm not sure quite yet, and I don't want to say anything and then, I mean, not necessarily regret it later, but I don't know. I'm not quite sure. But I think what Jameelah said uh, hit on something for me is I know I care about language, and something I said earlier is I've been thinking heavily on ethics and um, thinking about the fact that people have choices and think that they don't, and that think people have power. People have power and they think that they don't. Um, and I'm thinking about the way that power moves and informs every aspect of our lives, even when we're by ourselves. The way we talk about ourselves in isolation. Um, and I feel like that's what motivates me to continue to do this work, is just the knowledge that people have done the things that I think I could never do. There are histories and stories and tales of folks who have accomplished things that we could never conceive currently. And it's all happened and it's all very real. And I think that reminder is extremely powerful and it's moving. And I think bringing each of our aspects, each of the aspects of our research, our presentations, our different ways of thinking, our different ways of knowing, and letting people know that you have an option, um, I think would inspire us all to kind of undertake something daring and something courageous. I think one of my favorite activist intellectuals is Amilcar Cabral. And his work wasn't perfect, and he talked a lot about changing the culture before you can have any type of revolutionary um, uh, origins. Any revolutionary beginning has to begin with changing the culture, or else you're just replacing the society that you just burned down. And I think why I do this work, what I want to see is like, how do you do that again? And how do you do it here? And probably in one of the most dangerous uh, countries and one of the most like late stage capitalism situations, and just continue to think about I guess like the difficulty between possibility and impossibility at the same time, and knowing that uh, I don't know, there's like a deep down knowing that I feel like I would love people to learn about. I feel like a lot of my Black Studies education came by like a deep study in a certain search within the interior edges of myself, that came before anything, uh, anything as in my research or my understanding of relationality, how I connect with people. Like it began with me and like self empowerment and self wisdom and self education, which I think is a big part of Black study that can be externally influenced or externally imposed. But I think that that spark or that trigger happens, has to happen for yourself first. So I think, uh, I guess to return to my point, I'm not quite sure, but I feel like some type of political, ethical reimagining of like a revolutionary subject, what that looks like, for everyone to come into a certain type of consciousness, knowing that there are political beings, whether you choose to be or not, and you can either use the forces that you have to a certain goal, or you can be passive about it. And I feel like starting with that, as much as I want to say all these other things and building different centers and institutions and changing pedagogy, I just feel like if a majority of folks don't come to a certain type of coming to consciousness, that I think Black Studies has kind of already laid, not even kind of, very much so already laid a groundway for. The Black radical tradition has already led a pathway for how to do this. If we don't reinvest in those processes and those structures and those knowledges and that deep, kind of uh, Mecca, you already mentioned it, like an erotic Audre Lorde type of knowing, it's just going to be much tougher. Then it's just going to be much, much tougher. And I'm sure it can get worse. So I don't know. Like I said, I think that just bringing knowledge to folks and consciousness to folks and into myself, and to constantly question, and to constantly understand the choice that you're making, and for it to be kind of like a semiotic second nature when you're presented with a certain stimuli. How will you respond? What is your responsibility? How you react, and how will you test yourself? How will how do you negotiate those things? Negotiating with self is probably just my final answer.
And if I could just quickly add to, I feel like I love everything you just said, Melaine, too. And that's why so much of what I care about is the rigor of feeling and thinking through feeling. I think that academia, or like the way in which Western society structures academia, is that it's devoid of feeling, you know, be irrational, be whatever. But being more in tune with feeling is what allows us to connect to these ideas in a philosophical way, in a more meaningful way, purposefully driven way as well. So I just really appreciate the call to return back to spirit, to go inward and to find the source within too. And then also too, like to really, in addition to really being able to identify and feel confident in what we're fighting against, to also be clear about what we're fighting for, like what we're trying to, the world we're trying to envision and build and be a part of, not only just for the world, but for ourselves as well too, which is why I love Robin D.G. Kelly's Freedom Dreams, like just thinking about the importance of dreaming and envisioning as well. So just thank you for sharing that. It really resonated.
Wonderful. Yes. Let's keep talking. Like, I would love to take up some of the questions in the chat. And I would love to, we'll go, I see it too right now, and we'll go backwards so that, there's a question for you, Jordan. When you talk about the synonymous relationship between love and violence, and can you talk more about where we have placed the limits of both categories to function as distinct, as a way to obscure the collapse?
Okay. Thank you for the question. Yeah, actually, yeah. I was going to, what I regret the most about the talk I just gave is that I didn't begin with the epigraph. I was only going to read one epigraph, but I forgot to read it. And it was by Patrice D. Douglas. And she said in a talk once, there's too much of a reliance on thinking slavery as malicious behavior. And that, that quote changed my life. Like, it was like reading scenes in a quote, like scenes of subjection, again in a quote though. And I say that because I think that's precisely where the limit, where the limit is drawn between love and violence, is we think that slavery is about malicious behavior. We think that slavery is about laceration and direct violence and spectacular scenes of, when we think of slavery, when we think of hate, when we think of violence, we think of like lynching, and that's kind of the iconographic image, or you know, whipping, and I think that line of thinking has been exhausted in a particular kind of way, or at least Saidiya Hartman has taught us that line of thinking is not as productive as if we would begin to think about ways in which violence is not malicious, in fact. The ways in which violence is actually bound up with romance and desire and sentimentality. You know, I don't think that it's a coincidence that she begins with sentimentality and scenes of subjection. And so that I think that is where we begin to draw the line, and with these assumptions about what we think violence is and what love is not. And to the point of love, on the other hand, I think we also make assumptions about love as, again, in a very Lordian sense, as love as some kind of means by which we can connect with others and connect with ourselves. And I think that the question of relation is a vexed one for the Black subject. Relation with oneself and relations with others. I think that is the kind of central lesson of Black Skin, White Masks. And I think that if that is a central lesson, then I can't assume that love is a modality by which I can know myself, or a modality by which I can know anyone else. In fact, as Fanon says, love, the very possibility to speak in terms of love, should invite us to think about its imperfections and its perversions. The way in which the very possibility of that kind of grammar re-entrenches the very modalities of slavery and colonialism. And I don't think that it's a mistake that fascism begins with German Romanticism, right? Like, I don't think that that's a mistake. I think that, and I think we would do a better service to think about love in that genealogy as well. And I also think, last thing I'll say is that I don't think that our Lord is outside of that genealogy. So hopefully it kind of clears up, says a little something about what I think is being obscured and the lines I think are being drawn.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. I want to so we're going to wrap around 7:15 just so that we get and so I would love for us, there's one more question that's a bit broader, and so I just would love to take that up for now, in terms of it's for everyone. But I also want to invite everyone that if there's some queries that you want us to also kind of take away, like as we kind of keep going, keep thinking hopefully together in different spaces. I would love for you to kind of put that in the room as well. Like, and I think, and Jordan, I think what you just said, that this idea of this questioning, the pressing on relationality, so key for us to take with us. And so that is the type of thing I am thinking through and carrying with. I think there's a question about the genealogies of Black studies, and this is also something that Melaine, you referenced already in your response, and thinking about the kind of genealogies, and also thinking about these, these were also kind of referenced in your presentations in different ways. And I would love to, are there other genealogies that you would really like to kind of cite right now, offer networks, are kind of offer relations to, put in the room for us? Thinking about the Black arts tradition, imprisoned intellectuals, Black radical tradition. Are there other commitments that are coming together for your work that you didn't get to talk about?
I guess I'll say really quickly that, the first line of my paper, the intro, is me introducing myself as an antisocial queer theorist, was very difficult for me because I struggled a lot about whether or not I want to be a Black queer theorist or an antisocial queer theorist. And I chose the antisocial for a lot of reasons, but I think that, again, to locate myself within a particular genealogy, that I knew I'm still in conflict with. And so that Afro-pessimism for sure is another genealogy, which I would say is, of course, a part of this kind of Black radical political thought tradition. So yeah, those would be just two.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. I also have if there's any other thoughts, please put them in. I have a question on time too that we can go to as well.
I guess just super quick on the question of where do we locate ourselves? I think for me, definitely coming into it, I felt very firmly located in kind of the Black radical tradition, and still to this day. And I think the learning process for me, Kehinde Andrews, who is a Black studies scholar in the UK, he has this really good book. It's a fun read. It's Back to Black Radicalism for the 21st Century. And he kind of moves through all of the different ideologies that have been placed under this umbrella term of what we think of Black radical thought. And he basically goes through and challenges yeah, this was real, and yeah, this was important, but was it deeply radical? And kind of the end result is a lot of what the end result that people were coming through at the different phases of engaging with Black radicalism. My work right now is situated late 60s, 70s, but we all know Black power did not start then. It's an ideology that extends as far back as we do. And I think I keep coming to, within this network of all these things that I grew up, the way that I grew up was around the Nation of Islam. I grew up around a lot of cultural nationalism, Black nationalism, things that gave me tools to make me a strong Black person. But I always felt like I was living with contradictions as a woman, as a young person, as a queer person, all of these things. I felt like there was no true Black ideology that was speaking to real me. And then you start to ask these questions, well, what is Blackness? And you start to get engaged in diasporic thinking. And the one thing that I always can come back to and feel is a rock for me. And maybe we have to talk about, like, do you need a rock, right? What does it mean to float and to recognize that nothing is going to serve every purpose? But within that genealogy, I think revolutionary Pan-Africanism is something that I find to be like a truly embracing radical concepts, not only of Blackness and of our diaspora connections community, but also a true inclusivity of what Blackness can mean, and an openness and a lovingness to the idea of some of the things that we have touched on, right? Conflict, disagreement, different honor. It's all ways of pursuing Black thought and Black freedom. And so for me, I think that is a language that, you know, we're growing scholars and academics. These are things that we talk about all the time, but it's been a minute since I sat on somebody's stoop or at somebody's dinner table and we was having those conversations about revolutionary Pan-Africanism that I know used to be the stoop conversations because they was taught to me. And so I think for me, definitely locating this work in what I would consider to be Black radical intellectual thought, Black radical genealogy, but also inviting kind of like this more futuristic ideology of what it means to be a Black radical. I think we've been fed so many ideas of what a Black radical looks like, what a Black radical can be. We've got people doing amazing work like Ashley Farmer, her book, Remaking Black Power, and talking about the way that Black women have had fashioned the idea of Black power, and not starting in the 60s, she takes it back to like the 20s. Yeah, I think that's where I would locate the work. And I hope that when people read the work, they start to connect schooling as I think it was Melaine who was saying that, like, people think that they're non-political beings, but they are. They think they don't have power, but they do. I hope they start to see some of their everyday actions as parents. Like Elizabeth Todd Brilliant talks about parents as educational reformers, like seeing yourself, even the little things that you do that you consider just a part of your daily survival, right? Figuring out how to educate your baby. That is a radical act as a Black person in this world. That is a part of this genealogy, and feeling confident in locating yourself and having these everyday conversations about it. I think that's kind of where I locate this project. But I think it's so important as Black people to not get confined, to not put yourself in a box, to not say that this project is me. This is this project. And even just hearing from my incredible and awe-inspiring co-panelists, I'm thinking of different ways, different threads that I can pull. And so that's how I speak to that question about locating ourselves in genealogies and Black intellectual traditions.
And just building on that too, I think an important thing for me has been to the point of revolutionary Pan-Africanism is just being transnational in the focus and really trying to also tap back into pre-colonial ideas of what Black people have been and who they are and what we can achieve. And I think so much of that gets muddled with what we experience now, that we and especially the ways in which history gets elided and gets rewritten in weird ways, that we don't get to tap into those histories. So that's something that's really important for me, to rediscover those histories for myself, and then find ways to connect them to the questions I'm pursuing in a contemporary way. I also would say too, like, I'm really drawn, the Black arts movement is like just by far one of the periods of times that I feel very moved by and connected to, in part because I'm trying to figure out a way to engage with the realities of the threat of white supremacy and all these things without being distracted by it. So really trying to figure out new ways of being and existing in the world outside of the ways in which that kind of way of being and thinking through the world has structured the world. And so that's a really important thing, just to think about the artists. And I always say artists are my favorite scholars, you know, the ways in which we like kind of research and then create in response to that. And so really trying to tap into, draw into that history as well. And then just thinking about continuing to honor the relationship between art, culture, and politics for Black people. So yeah, those are the histories and lineages that I'm also participating in.
Wonderful.
I know we don't have that much time. This is a tough one for me too. I feel like I have a journaling exercise that is really important for me to do after this. I agree with Mecca. I think I definitely align myself with the Black arts movement traditions, but I mean, as well as the Black radical tradition, but I think defining radical is really important. Specifically, I think a lot on, my project is on Afro-Surrealism in the US and Francophone worlds, and so Black worlds. And so I've been drawn to blues and jazz folk in particular, and I feel like they warrant a little bit more attention when it comes to their involvement in rural communities and inner city Black communities. I think I think my research interests stem from just like my own feelings about the way that I think, I guess, and so I think a lot about how we have to constantly balance. The imperative, but also just indulgence to a certain extent, being present entirely, so much so that the future is created not necessarily without any intentionality or awareness of it, but it is created presently. And so, as much as I want to think about a future or like a forward motion or progress, even progress, y'all know the outcomes or something else, but I feel like a lot of my research interests and a lot of my alignment with certain political agents and creative figures comes from the fact that a lot of it has to do with like uh, Black aesthetics related to experimentation and improvisation and not really knowing how but finding the tool anyway and just using whatever is available out of necessity to create something else that could be beautiful, could be ugly, could be both. I feel like that's the blues. I feel like that is a certain type of Black blues, a certain type of Black jazz aesthetic where even in the not knowing, there is still a knowing, and it creates something that was unbeknownst to anybody previously. Kind of that. I have a project coming up. It's called. There's a certain spark, like a poesis of it. There's a poetry and a poetics that comes from the being a certain present being, and I don't know. It's related to like a seriality. But really, I don't know too many other ways other than the way that I've seen it done by jazz musicians and jazz poets and people who actually live those type of lifestyles. And I feel like that is an aesthetic that can actually be leaned to more as a certain type of radicality.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you all for your wonderful work, thoughts, provocations, all of it. We just
stretching and gaping and
just
this vibrating church. I have no idea how exciting
turn it over
will be. Can you imagine me doing stretching, gaping,
you know what? One thing.
Plugging with this church. You have no idea how exciting that this product. Imagine tense anal stretching and
we're going to turn it over. So I just want to say thank you again for all of your thoughts. And we wish you all the very best. We know like we're in the midst of it, right? And I just want to wish you all just such good moments of work for these last quarters or terms or wherever you are in the moment in your work. All right. And I'd love to turn it over to Dr. Katie Dieter to close this out.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Aileen. I first want to say that we're just so incredibly grateful for these fruitful and generative offerings from all of the presenters, which really invite us to think deeply about a variety of topics and issues in Black studies. I also want to express deep gratitude again to Darion Wallace for organizing this event. Thank you so much. This has just been absolutely amazing. To Dr. Aileen Robinson for moderating the Q&A, and to our panelists. Wow, wow, wow. I'm just so overwhelmed with joy and also really with hope. To hear your scholarship and your clear, deep commitment to the field of Black studies, as well as, your dedication to the improvement of Black life and Black liberation. Audre Lorde states that without community, there is no liberation. So I'm always grateful for opportunities for us to be in community with one another, to think through ways that we can liberate, ways we can love, and engage in scholarship for us and for the communities that we care about, particularly at this time When Black Studies is under direct attack, it really just brings me immense hope to know that you all are engaging in such meaningful, deeply moving work. So again, thank you all so, so much for the time and the rigor you put into your research and your presentations today. And I have just a few quick announcements I'd like to offer before we hop off the call. Tomorrow in AAAS, we're having a get together in the office from 11:30 to 2:30. We'll have Caribbean food and music and games. I wish all these presenters could come and join us, but we will have your spirits there with us tomorrow. For those who are at Stanford, please do come, stop by. If you can't stay, you can just grab food. We'll have to-go containers. And then on February 28th, from 6 to 8 p.m. at Stanford Humanities Center, the Institute for Diversity in the Arts is having an event featuring sci-fi HBO writer Nnedi Okorafor in conversation with Ida visiting artist Ellen Sebastian Chang. And then this is a quick save the date. Our annual St. Clair Drake lecture will be featuring Robin D.G. Kelly this year, who will give a lecture titled Black Studies Against Fascism, Then and Now. And that will be April 27th. It's a Thursday at 5:30 in Stanford Memorial Church. So more on that soon. And so I know we're over time, so thank you all also for staying over. Truly, truly appreciate y'all. And once again, just thank you to the presenters, Darion, Aileen, really, really appreciate you all. So have a good evening, everyone. Let's stay in touch.